My name is Peter Knox. I'm the director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities here at Case Western Reserve, which is sponsoring this event this evening together with our friends at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And in particular, I want to thank Jason Hanley, Andy Leach, and John Gerke at the Rock Hall for helping to make this evening go smoothly. As many of you know, we had to change venues because of the demand for this event, and there are always challenges that go along with that, and we're very grateful for our friends for helping to make that possible. Thank you for coming. My academic home is classical studies, so it's of particular interest to me that the resurgence of interest in Bob Dylan as a literary figure has at its core many of my friends and colleagues in the field of classical studies, and there are very good reasons for that, which you will hear something about this evening. But I'm not going to take your time with my ideas on the subject. I'm here to introduce our panel this evening. Daniel Goldmark, my friend and colleague here at Case Western Reserve University in the music department, who is also the director of our Center for Popular Music Studies. Daniel has published numerous volumes and articles and delivered papers on jazz, cartoon music, the history of the music industry, and subjects related to popular music in general. On the far end of the podium, to my right, to your left, is Thomas Palaima, coming to us from the University of Texas, where he is the Robert M. Armstrong Centennial Professor. He is a classical scholar of distinction and a Dylanologist as well. He received a MacArthur Genius Award for his work on early Greek, which is clearly related to Bob Dylan. He is a frequent contributor to the Austin American Statesman and other news media on topics related to contemporary issues, including veterans affairs and politics. And the occasion of our coming together this evening is the publication of a new book on Bob Dylan by my old friend and colleague Richard Thomas, seated in the center here, who is the George Martin Lane Professor.
If we're going to the UK, you get this time there.
Richard is the George Martin Lane Professor of the Classics at a small college in Massachusetts outside Boston called Harvard. He is also an extremely distinguished scholar in the field of Latin literary studies, having published the go-to commentary on Virgil's Georgics, a volume on Virgil called Reading Virgil and His Texts, Virgil and the Augustan Reception, and he is one of the co-editors of the 3-volume Virgil Encyclopedia. But he is a Dylanologist of distinction. I was about to say extinction. Co-editor of the online volume on the performance artistry of Bob Dylan. His recent book, which will actually not be published until next week, Why Bob Dylan Matters. The title is intended to imply the answer to the question that a lot of people raised not so long ago when Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Copies of it, I understand, are available in the foyer for purchase, and Richard will be available to sign after our conversation this evening. The Baker Nord Center is non-commercial, and we have no stake in Richard's sales, but holiday season is approaching. And for that very special someone who has everything else, there will be copies available. So Richard will say a few words about how he became interested in Bob Dylan, about his course at Harvard, which was covered in the New York Times in an article about the coolest class at Harvard, a freshman seminar called familiarly Bob Dylan 101. Personally, I always thought his coolest class was Latin prose composition. But We'll have time for some Q&A afterwards. So in the meantime, please join me in welcoming our panel this evening.
Thank you, Peter, on behalf of the panel, and it's great to be here. I'm going to talk for just 10 or 15 minutes, so, and I want to talk about the book, but also talk a bit about how I came to write the book and how important Dylan is really to the humanities. And so it's appropriate that we are being supported not just by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but in particular by the Baker-Nord Humanities Center. So I, like many of you, started listening to Bob Dylan. I sang Blowin' in the Wind when I was 14 in 1963, 1964 in my school choir. And I've been with Dylan ever since. Dylan was I was a fan probably through into the 70s when I started seeing Greek and Roman lyric poets as being similar to Dylan in terms of a lot of the themes: love, loss, death, grief, human things that basically we all share, and that artists who can capture those human things in the highest, with the highest aesthetic art, basically talk to all of us, and that's what the humanities is. The humanities is the expression of what it is to be a human being at the highest level, and therefore sublimating, universalizing that experience. And whether we realized it, I didn't, back in the 60s and 70s, whether we realized that that's what Dylan was, that is what he was. So Dylan looked like a lot of my poets, a young Roman poet Catullus, who writes basically about a love affair that goes wrong, and also writes about the death of his brother. I don't think Dylan was reading the classics at that point, but I think he was very much affected by and a part of that stream, as I call it in the book, the tradition, the stream that flows from Homer, and I'll end my remarks with Homer, the first poet of the West. So it was really in 2001 when Love and Theft came out, and the song Lonesome Day Blues suddenly had 2 lines from Virgil, the aforementioned poet on whom I work. I'm going to tame the, I've got to get my notes here, but basically at that point, bring peace to the people and gonna tame the proud, and that is straight out of this passage of Aeneid 6 of Virgil. And so I suddenly thought, I'd been thinking since about 1997, with Time Out of Mind, that some of the songs, Highlands and others, the way Highlands is channeling Robert Burns from the 18th century, but then Dylan has famously said, I'll start out with a folk line and then see where it goes, and anything can happen. So I think that process was happening already in 1997, and in the Ed Bradley 60 Minutes interview, in which Bradley starts quoting "It's All Right, Ma," and says to Dylan, so where does that come from? Where does that music, that poetry, those words come from? And Dylan, I'm sure most of you saw it, Dylan said, I don't know where that comes from. And Bradley said, can you still do that? And Dylan says, no, I can't, but I can do other things. And I think some of the other things that he was doing since 97, and particularly 2001, is basically consciously doing not what he had done in the 60s and 70s, where he's accidentally coinciding with a lot of these authors, but consciously actually reading and integrating the lyrics of my poetry, basically the Greek and Roman poets, who also are at the center of the humanities, in that their art states what it means to be a human being, what it means to lose your companion in battle, the Iliad, what it means to look for homecoming and not be able to find homecoming in the Odyssey, all of Greek tragedy. And so that's a tradition that Dylan is in, and is in consciously. So I want to just say point to a few things in the book. So first of all, on page 194. The book, by the way, since I was teaching on the day that the Nobel was awarded, October 13th, 2016, I had two agents, and I was in the New York Times. I think Jeff Rosen, Bob Dylan's manager, immediately called the New York Times would have called him, and he immediately said, talk to Thomas, because what the Bob Dylan office obviously would have liked is what they got, namely Dylan taught in Harvard seminar. And that, I think, was a very clever way of beginning the combat to those who said Dylan doesn't deserve a Nobel. He does songs, he's not a poet, he's not literary. So I think that was very deliberate. So I agreed to write this book and wrote it in about 9 or 10 months. I'm not sure entirely how it happened. And my wife, who's sitting here, well, you can talk to her about what an unpleasant 9 months it was from her perspective. But anyway, it happened, and I'm very happy with it. So basically, I talk about intertextuality, by which I mean it's a fairly recent term, and it means different things to different people. But let me just quote T.S. Eliot. The first bit will be familiar. Immature poets borrow, mature poets steal. Bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. The good poet welds his theft into a whole of feeling which is unique, utterly different from that from which it is torn. The bad poet throws it into something which has no cohesion, and this is important. A good poet will usually borrow from authors remote in time, or alien in language, or diverse in interest. So that this is Eliot in 1920, and of course, Dylan in Desolation Row already has Eliot in that song, has the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock in that song, along with Ezra Pound. And but Dylan was already doing this with Arthur Rimbaud, for instance, Chimes of Freedom, or Mr. Tambourine Man. Those are songs which are basically taking the symbolism, the surrealism, the incoherence, the sort of marvelous sort of lack of temporal and other logic, and sort of putting it into his songs. So it's already been there. But so Rome is important to Dylan, and some of you may know that this starts really in his sophomore year in 1957, when he essentially walks into a Latin class as a sophomore at Hibbing High. Why he walked into that Latin class, I don't really know. Of course, Dylan doesn't tell you anything about why he did anything or why he writes anything. Dylan's school records disappeared from a very meticulous school office, and so nobody even knows what Dylan took. But Dylan, in his yearbook in 1959, has 3 details. The first one is well known: to join Little Richard. The second one is Latin Club, sophomore year, and the third one is American Studies or Social Studies. So those 3 details, and so I got to thinking that Dylan, I started Latin in 1959 when I was 9 years old. Dylan started it in 1957 when he was 15, 16 years old. So that was a bond that nobody who's written on Dylan extensively has that bond. So I'm Dylan. Bob and I are pretty close. He may not know that yet, but I hope he'll read the book. But there was just something, I know why I did Latin in 1959. It was partly I liked languages, but it was partly also I liked movies about Romans and Christians, and Dylan was watching those same movies in the mid-50s or so. So that Hollywood, particularly with McCarthyism, was using Rome as a metaphor. So Roman oppression of Christians as a metaphor for what McCarthy and the right was doing to Hollywood, blacklisting Hollywood directors and actors and so on. So it was a safe-ish topic. But Dylan, of course, had an uncle who owned a theater, the Libba, and Dylan went free. And Dylan saw all these movies, and he talks in Chronicles, his memoir, which is really a novel or Bob Dylan song and prose, whatever you want to call it. But Dylan talks about these movies, and he clearly, if anyone's been, who's been to Hibbing, Minnesota? Okay, you should go. It's a wonderful, right? Yeah, it's a wonderful place, and you really get a sense of Dylan, what it was like for this kid who must have known from early on that he was a genius, that there was something about him, which is why he didn't talk about what he's feeling. I spoke to a girl who was she's now 76, but who was in the Latin club with him, and Dylan's father got her father to give Bob a ride back to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, about a 4.5 hour drive. And Bob, she said, he just sat in the back seat with his guitar between his knees, and he didn't say one word the whole time. And that's because Dylan, it's inside, and it comes out in the art. So anyway, he wrote a song. You know, he went in 1962, end of 1962. He went to England to film the BBC show, which sadly the BBC didn't keep the tape Madhouse on Castle Street. And he did his first trip to Europe. That was his first trip out of the US to the UK, and he went to Rome. And I think Rome has always been there. And he came back. Susie Rotolo was in Italy, and that's why we have these great songs, Boots of Spanish Leather. She gave us those songs because Dylan was pining away in the village and writing these fantastic songs in her absence. So he went there, and he came back in 1963 in January at Gerde's Folk City. He sings a song that's never recorded. It's on the so-called banjo tape, the bootleg tape. And it's a song called Going Back to Rome. And basically it goes like, I'm going back to Rome, that's where I was born. So that's where I was born. He's often said he was born in the wrong place to the wrong parents, but saying he was born in Rome, and I'm going back to Rome a month after returning from it. And I think he's always gone to Rome, so that before 2001, before Love and Theft came out, he of course, had that Rome press conference in which he again says, there were people here before me a long time ago in this city who were much wiser and were going around walking the city. And a month later, out comes this album with lines of Virgil on it. So he's planting these clues. None of the journalists get them because because of his elusiveness. So that's Latin, and that's Virgil. I'd like now to quickly end with a bit on Homer and end up my situation. So in around 2010, Bob Dylan, he had read the Odyssey in school. He claims he had in a Nobel lecture. But in about 2010, he read the Odyssey, and he started becoming Odysseus, literally becoming Odysseus by putting lines of Homer into songs. So Working Man's Blues #2 had some Ovid in there. No one could ever say that I took up arms against you. The printed lyrics, that's gone completely. And what's there in its place is this stanza. I'll be back home in a month or two when the frost is on the vine. I'll punch my spear right straight through, halfways down your spine. I'll lift my arms to the starry skies and pray the fugitive prayer. I'm guessing tomorrow the sun will rise. I hope the final judgment's fair. So in Odyssey Book 10, Odysseus says to the king who's entertaining him, describes how he killed a deer, square in the backbone, halfway down the spine, and my bronze spear went punching clean through. He dropped in the dust, groaning, gasping out his breath. That's Homer. And essentially, basically, the words of Odysseus, not the narrative, but just the words of Odysseus, are taken over by Bob Dylan, who then, I had written this book by June 5th, and then the Nobel lecture came out. If you haven't heard it, listen to it with the musical score of the jazz pianist lightly in the background. But one of the three books, All Quiet on the Western Front, Moby Dick, and then finally the Odyssey, are the books that Dylan talks at about being formative of him. And he says of Odysseus, he's always been warned of things to come, teaching things he's not told to, taking two roads, but they're both bad, both hazardous. Or you could drown on one, on the other you could starve. He goes into the narrow straits, meets, so he's describing Odysseus, but then in that next paragraph, in a lot of ways, some of these same things have happened to you. And the you there has to be Bob Dylan. You too have had drugs dropped into your wine. You too have shared a bed with the wrong woman. Plenty of those, right? You too have been spellbound by magical voices, sweet voices and strange melodies. And you've had close calls as well. And you too have rambled this country all around. And you've also felt that ill wind, that one that blows you no good. And that's not all of it. And I think he's here basically saying that we all have a bit of Odysseus in us, and I think he's also channeling the great modern Greek poet Constantine Kavafis' poem Ithaca, so don't be in too much of a hurry to reach Ithaca. It's the journey that is important, and so Bob Dylan is still on that journey. We saw him in Akron 2 weeks ago. I'll see him in New York at the end of the tour in 8 days, and so I think my time is up, so I guess we move to the next phase at this point.
I just want to tell you all what a magnificent presentation that was by Richard, and encourage you to buy the book and copies of it for friends. It's a magnificent study that really gets you inside one of the things Richard didn't mention, so I'll mention it here, just how much hard work it takes to create the perfect songs that Dylan creates. Richard lets us inside that by showing the degree to which Dylan is operating like Virgil and like Horace and so forth, looking to antecedents, making old things new, putting things. The art of intertextuality is to give us connections to things that we may only understand subliminally or from elsewhere, but they allow us to do exactly what we're doing with our lives as we move through them. You mentioned that you were talking to this young high school buddy, a woman, girl, but she's now 76. But she's not 76 in Bob Dylan's memory. And the people, I have my good friend from high school here, Brian Corrigan. I've known him since we were 6 years old together at Assumption School. But the Brian I see here is the composite of all those Brians and all those years in the past. And that's what Dylan has been trying to capture, this human side. Those of you who have, remember Blood on the Tracks and the Tangled Up in Blue. And now I'm going on back again. I've got to get to them somehow. And in a new lyric, he says, yesterday is dead and gone, but tomorrow might as well be now. And another time he says, in another comment, he's not entirely reticent about what he's doing, but he said with Blood on the Tracks, especially Tangled Up in Blue, I succeeded in what I wanted to do. I put yesterday, today, and tomorrow in the same room. And that's how our memories function. I think of the time I met you at St. Andrews for the first time, and when we were talking together. But I also remember the show we've just shared in Akron, and the time you came down to Austin to see Bob at the backyard. And so when we look at other people in our lives, we're always seeing them at different points. And so one of the great creations, great achievements of Dylan, and Richard points this out in his book, and maybe we can investigate it further, it is the way he said at that juncture he wanted his songs to be like paintings, because he's also a painter. And he has this tremendous capacity to see things, to see human beings, and really try to question what they are. But he said, he wants his songs to be like paintings. And if you think of his best songs, they're vivid in a way that Faulkner's vivid, or Hemingway is vivid. in a great, in a direct way. But he also said he wanted to essentially break up time. And when you look at it, as an isolated comment and don't think about it, it may sound like utterly fantastic. But what a great genius and a great poet will often do is reduce things that, they'll be able to speak the things that are ineffable, speak things that almost can't be articulated, and they'll be there symbolically or something like that. And the other thing is that they will create images for us that we can retain. The last thing I'll say, and then maybe we can start, maybe this will be a trigger. Besides being a literary artist, and with Homer, Richard was getting onto this, Dylan is also, and what his first inspiration was the great Woody Guthrie. That is somebody who was coming out of the folk music tradition, the folk music tradition that can be connected with people who are illiterate, and things are remembered in memory and are carried on through time with variance. So he learned all that. But our popular music, and it's great to have the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame here in Cleveland, because popular music is the way that most Americans, and probably most human beings who have ever walked on the face of the earth, have taken in poetry. I'm reminded of this because Wilfred Owen, I do a lot of research with war poets. Wilfred Owen's, the first edition of Wilfred Owen's poems was in 300 copies. The greatest poet of the First World War, who gives us vividly how ghastly it is to be fighting in trench warfare. 300 copies. And by 1928, when they decided to do another edition, it had sold fewer than 2,000 copies. So popular music is where it's at to communicate some of the things that people who are just mere literary poets want to tell us, but don't have the opportunity because they can't reach us.
You can probably talk about this more, but I'm thinking about, sing, oh, muse, right? I mean, these opening words, from Homer, I mean, it's not just about popular music, it's about music in general. I had a question, though, that I want to specifically about the book. And I've read the book, forgive me, I know none of you have yet, you will. The book brings together a lot of themes of then and now, both for Dylan, but also, because you're looking at all of these poets that Dylan is drawing on. And so this book to me seems as much of a memoir as anything else. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this specifically, Richard, in particular, how much of it is a memoir of your experience with Dylan, because there is a great deal of you in this book. And I think for everybody, I would imagine everybody here, their own experience of Dylan, of course, is their personal engagement with him. It's not just, oh, I heard that Dylan did these things and that made him great. It's, he had an effect on me as a person. So can you talk about that? And Thomas as well.
Sure. How's that? No?
Give it a second. It'll come on.
How's that?
There we go.
Yeah. Yeah, so the first chapter, which is about, I use the word together through life, which of course Bob Dylan used for the album of 2009. And I think Dylan is there talking about together through life with his fans when in Mississippi he sings, I've got nothing but affection for all those who've sailed with me. He's talking about us guys. I mean, I think Dylan needs his audience as much as we need him. It's a symbiotic thing. He said, there's nothing worse than performing, but there's nothing else that I want to do than perform. So yeah, the early bits of the book in particular were personal, about bringing Blonde on Blonde and Songs of Leonard Cohen, the only two albums I bought from New Zealand. And so I decided there's so much on Dylan. Everyone knows what is to be known about Dylan, except the Latin Club. I found a very interesting document there. So I thought I would do the summary of Dylan's sort of career, partly through my experience with him. And it is personal. I hope it's also interesting, and it's always focused on Dylan. But yeah, and Dylan's Nobel, where he tells his story, and he says it starts with Buddy Holly, talking about seeing Buddy Holly at the Duluth Armory days before Buddy Holly's plane went down. And and that Buddy Holly looked at me. He was just feet away, and something was transmitted. And Dylan, you know, he talks about transfiguration later on. This Hell's Angel, whose name happened to be Bob Zimmerman, who was killed in a cycle crash in '63, not quite '66, when Dylan's crash, whatever that was, happened. So, and Dylan talks about acquiring the vernacular of the folk music. I knew John the Revelator. I knew, you know, the characters from folk, and I think that Dylan actually becomes them as he's become Homer. I think he populates literature and he populates song and the characters of song, and in the process gives us these new genres, so that folk rock, I mean, country rock, I mean, what he's doing now, integrating in his set lists the American standards that rock and roll came to destroy. Bob Dylan is now rescuing them. I think he's preserving the classics. I think he sees his mission as preserving culture. I think that's what's interesting about the classical text too.
And because you mentioned memoir, I'm a Cleveland boy, Assumption School and St. Ignatius. I owe it to my brother, who's sitting here in the second row, that my whole life was changed. I was asked about 10 years ago to list the 10 most important books, and I said, well, I'm from a different generation. Can it be books, movies, and records? But the two records that I listened to, one before high school because of my brother, was Bringing It All Back Home. I still have the monorail copy that has Michael Palima's signature on the back, but he's not getting it back. If actually, my son, who just graduated from Berklee College of Music, has it now, and that's another story. But rather than talk about my own response to Dylan, I had asked permission at the start to read you something. How many of you have read Michael Decapité's Through the Windshield? Has anyone here read it? Yes, it's a tremendous book written by a native Clevelander who was born in '62. In 1982 was driving a cab in the area we now call the Tremont District. And as I said, if you can imagine Charles Bukowski with the sensibilities of Tim O'Brien writing what Travis Bickle would have seen through a windshield of a taxi driving around Cleveland, that's what Michael Decapité captures in a Dylan-esque way, absolutely human. Nobody is made fun of. Nobody is satirized. Everybody is taken for who they are. But here, I was reading, besides Through the Windshield, he's written just a couple other short little novellas. One is called Radiant Fog. And he's 15 years old, he's a Clevelander, so this is 1977, and it's his memoir. When I was 15, I walked into one of the mall record stores where a harmonica was playing and looked up as though I was in church. You know how you look up? By reflex? Just like that. The record, as it turned out, was Blood on the Tracks, and the song was Tangled Up and Blue. I later found out from the words, though I heard instantly in the music, that the record was about the road. It was about a life lived from place to place, person to person, job to job, but ultimately alone. It was about being honest rather than good. It accepted the nature of time and change and imagined life as a series of episodes and entanglements which add up to an idea. The harmonica poured its heart out, and the music glittered like sunlight on the spokes of a wheel or the surface of a stream. That moment was one of those recognitions about how things are and are going to be, and that simple yet vaulting song has been like a church to me ever since. Springtime always brings me back around to Blood on the Tracks, which is about the presence of the past as much as anything else. The bare branches down the street are pricked by a needlework of new leaves, and the blue sky is a color you look into rather than at. Yesterday, a Friday, I played the record before I left the house. I took the train to work and sat outside the Reed for half an hour. When I got home, my room was cool with late afternoon shadow, and the sky was bright above the alley. I set an ashtray on the trunk by the window, started Blood on the Tracks, put my feet up on the desk and let it roll. It was hard to take. These things get harder as you get older, maybe because you realize they're out of your reach. You realize how difficult they were to achieve, how transparent, what a miracle they are. Beauty walks a razor's edge. Someday I'll make it mine. And that encapsulates, this guy's a wonderful author, and it encapsulates his reaction to Dylan, but talks about some of these qualities that we've been talking about, that there's a visualness of Dylan because he can see things. And I'll just stop with this little excursus with the Greeks used the perfect of the verb I see to mean I know. That was their basic definition of knowing. Namely, I saw something in the past, and I retain it now, and it's still valid in the present. Eidon and oida. And they even pun with Oedipus, that he's somebody who sees and therefore has to blind himself because of the terror of the knowledge that he finds out. And I think that there's that aspect in Dylan as well. I really think he's very, very visual, and that he's learned how to, he says he wants his songs to be like paintings, but I think it's the paintings in his mind that have turned into song. If you understand what I mean. So when you listen to him again, just to think of the images he's conjuring up, no matter what song you put on in the CD player.
If I could quickly, and of course, he's doing painting lessons right around that album. So I was able to get access to some of the archives in Tulsa, and particularly around Tangled Up and Blue, as Tom says. And I thought I was interested in this partly because I was juxtaposing Virgil. We are told we have the Virgil's life. Virgil died in 19 BC, but we're told in the morning he would do a bunch of verses, and then in the afternoon he'd whittle them down and lick them into shape and get them just right. So Tangled Up in Blue was at one point called Dusty Sweatbox Blues. Good thing he kept working on it, right? Then Carnation Blues was one, and then he eventually got to Tangled Up in Blue. And one page is this 5x3 notebook with tiny hand of these drafts. And you can see from this, he said, I did Blowing in the Wind in 10 minutes. I told Leonard Cohen I did I and I in 15 minutes. Don't believe it for a minute. I mean, that's what people like Bob Dylan say. But this is just a few lines from Tangled Up in Blue. And it seems to be a play of some sort seems to be involved. So called for you backstage that night, but it was too easy for you to leave. The second act had just begun when Adam first meets Eve. So you can hear the melody and the rhythms all there. I drifted into the audience of cattle dealers and pimps, blue smoke rising from the something. I tried to catch a glimpse, illegible. I got too overly involved. Called for you backstage that night. I think you were in a trance. The Prince of Darkness blew his lines, so I thought I'd take a chance. So you can all hear that the greatest song of the 70s basically there, but it's nowhere near being there yet. And he's just working on it and working on it and working on it. And then even the New York version finished in September of '74, he's not happy with, so he goes back to Minnesota. I was in Ann Arbor my first semester, New Zealander on my own in Ann Arbor, but going into the record store on South University to get the album that was coming out in December '74, and I went back day after day and it didn't appear, and we didn't know that it had been withdrawn and would come out in January '75. I made a lot of friends, ended up in late night bars with some of them, through that process, but it was Bob Dylan who was the glue, as he is for all of you. But I think we need to go to Daniel. But
it's your all show. Although you're mentioning the archives, I assume most people are aware that Dylan donated. I don't even know. I'm sorry, sold. Thank you. I'm sorry. They the word I was going to use was acquired. Yeah. Right. Most of the musicians these days do not donate. sold his materials to the archive in Tulsa. Can you just talk a little bit about your experience working with them? I mean, I don't imagine anyone here. Has anyone made that trek yet? No.
Yeah.
So,
Sure,
for
yeah.
someone who's as dedicated to this as you, was it just paper, or was it revelatory, or somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, well, it started, so a Japanese, when I was in the New York Times for the seminar, a Japanese film crew, 4 of them came over, and they followed me down to Florida just to film me walking in and out of the concert, and none of that made it into the final version. So I don't know what this cost them, but they also went to the archives, and they were allowed to film this notebook. And I got permission from the Dylan people to use it in my course, first of all, but then in the book. So I've since been to the archive. It's only just opening to scholars. You have to fill out forms. You have to have, for evidence of where you're going to publish it. But the 6,000 pieces, most of it is material like this, drafts of songs. It's a jacket that he wore at Newport in '65 when he went electric, but there's very few, there are very few sort of museum pieces like that. It's notes, it's thousands of hours of recordings. Every concert since 2002 has been recorded, so that we know what Sony's going to do with that archive once Bob's gone. There'll be years of great bootleg coming up. Of course, a lot of it's out. So it's a great resource, and the Woody Guthrie archive is there along with Pete Seeger and Phil Oakes, but so the Bob Dylan Center will be downtown, and things will rotate out of the archive, and so the public will have access to some of the archival material. But it's decades more of scholarship by us Dylanologists from precisely that passage that I read you. He got it. He waited till he got it right, and he got it right. I mean, Tangled Up and Blue is a perfect song, even in the various versions. And of course, then when he goes out of the studio, the process doesn't stop writing, right? So her eyes were blue, her hair was too, and if you see her, say hello. So it continues, and I mentioned putting Homer into Working Man Blues #2 instead of Arvid. So it's just this mind that is constantly moving and making associations, and always sort of ahead of us.
Going forward, let's stay with Tangled Up in Blue. She was working in a topless place. I stopped in for a beer. I kept looking at her face in the spotlight so clear. She was working in the blinding light. I stopped into for a drink. I kept looking at her face so white. I didn't know what to think. And then one of my favorites, she was working in the Tropicana. I stopped in for a beer. I told her I was going to go to Atlanta. She said, "No, you're going to stay right here." And so he keeps doing this. I mean, he never stops thinking and tinkering. And a lot of it has to do with, if you're looking at something and you just do this, you see it from a different perspective. And when Richard mentioned the archives, we had Michael Chaikin down to UT last spring for a big humanities lecture. He's the archivist, and he had worked with with Pennebaker, who had done "Don't Look Back," the famous film of the Dylan 1965 tour of England, I'm really glad in many ways that they chose as the archivist somebody who engages in film and music, not just somebody dealing with the printed text. But he has a very open attitude, even encouraging things like being able to get college students to come up with projects and have small fellowships where they can come. So the vision of it is not to be a very closed thing, but to be very, very open. And the last thing I wanted to say, triggered by Richard going back to talking about Woody Guthrie in the early days, Dylan's career is 50 years long now, and if he's always had a fascination for different names, masks, faces, different characters, he plays nobody, right, in Sam Peckinpah's, right? Yeah, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Alias, yeah. He can't even be nobody. That would be too Odyssean. So he has to be Alias. But during that time, he's had at least 20 different musical phases, right? But each one has been full-bore passionate. It's as if we not only have a genius, but a genius who has maintained a childlike enthusiasm for whatever is new that he wants to grab at the moment. So we now have the gospel bootlegs out. And I've listened to them, and they're just absolutely fabulous. But I was talking to an Australian film crew earlier today about Dylan's criminal music, things which he writes about criminals, often glorifying them to the horror of the rest of us. But he's trying to get inside what it must have been to be Joey Gallo. And there, but for the grace of God, if we weren't born into mafia families, we don't know what it's like. But if we had been, we may have turned out like Joey Gallo, so he wants us to know.
I'm glad you brought up the identities, because that was something I wanted to ask about. Although I very quickly want to say the fact that Dylan sold his materials and at a very good price, if you go back and see the article. But even here in Cleveland with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's Library and Archives, they have wonderful collections of various folks. And it seems like the folks now, but those were people like Ahmet Ertegun and a lot of people from the 1950s who started, who basically helped start the modern music industry. Now you have folks like Dylan, Lou Reed. There's a lot of artists from the 60s and 70s, or their descendants or their heirs, who are trying to keep their legacy alive, separate from the music itself. So I find it very interesting that Dylan was able to carve out this space. Not that he needed to. I don't think that anyone was going to doubt that he was going to persist for forever. But I want to go back to something you said about identities, because there are all these periods in Dylan's life. We can go very traditional and say, there's the early period, and then there's the first electric period, and then there's the post-accident and blah, blah, blah. But you spend a lot of time talking about very recent Dylan. The book really, you look to early songs, but it's albums of the last 20 years or so that I think you spend a lot of time on. So I wonder if you two, and then I think we're going to probably move on to some questions, if you two can talk just for a minute about maybe how you think of the way that his life divides up, and maybe why that focus.
Right. Well, starting from the back, I think there's no greater album than Tempest. Who listens to Tempest? Okay, so just probably about 10% of you get it, listen to it. It's fantastic. It's just and I have my young 18-year-olds think it's fantastic too. I listen to all of the old stuff, but there's this phase since 2001 that has produced particularly Modern Times and Tempest 2006 and 2012 that are just phenomenal. And also Dylan in performance is now doing only Tangled Up and Blue from the 70s, and then he's only doing pre-Blonde on Blonde 60s things, generally in the first set. Then he's only doing songs mostly from Tempest, early Roman Kings, in particular, Pay in Blood. So those are the songs that he thinks are right for him. And it's interesting that, the 70s are gone, and the 80s are gone too.
That would be another interesting discussion. Yeah. Tom, quickly?
I think every period of Dylan is fantastic, and it's not but the more recent stuff, as Richard points out in his book, the turning point really was Blood on the Tracks, working with a visual artist, Rabin, who was attuning him to really looking at things and trying to figure out what things were and how to paint them, and then also the realization that songs do not have to be coherent narratives. Because Dylan was a great movie fan, songs like Hurricane actually match Hurricane Carter's own account, called The 16th Round, with a jolting first scene. Pistol shots ring out in the barroom night. Enter Patty Valentine from another hall, from the upper hall. She sees a bartender in a pool of blood. She says, "My God, they've killed them all." That's the opening of a fantastic motion picture, if you think about it. But now, I agree, Tempest has blockbusters. I remember writing Jeff Rosen when I put it on. I said, I can't listen to Long and Wasted Years. We held each other on a cold and frosty morn. We held each other because our souls were torn. So much for tears. so much for the long and wasted years. That's just the end of it. But the rest of the song is taking you from different places, different times, even maybe different persons. Because what Richard started with, Dylan is a humanities education in himself. He's a humanities education in himself. And if we devalue Dylan, it's because in this mindless and heartless society of ours, where the S sign with two vertical strokes seems to be what matters at every turn, and it devalues the humanities in general, that would be why we would want to neglect Bob Dylan. But until then, just have your kids listen to Dylan. As I used to sing Dylan to my son as nursery rhymes, and your kids just get fixed. So in Delia, he shot poor Delia down with a cruel 44, but he had concert variants, a smoking 44 or a cold blue steel 44. And if I sang the variants, my son would say, "No, Dad, Dylan sings it the other way." And I didn't have the heart to say, no, James, he sings it all three ways.
Just one footnote. So much for tears, so much for those long and wasted years. He's saying to the woman, those years were wasted. How different is that from, you just kind of wasted my precious time? No, wasted, repeated in the same two. But in Tempest, the brutality of that song, of that 20-whatever-year-old, has retreated, and there's an empathy. So the wasted years, there's a sorrow about it, which is not there in Don't Think Twice. So, but again, the whole life, the whole career is a continuum, and I used to think the 80s he went off, but you go back to YouTube and it's all good, as Bob said.
I just have one short thing. If you want to think about Bob Dylan's genius from the start, somebody asked me the other day, are there songs that don't have their titles taken from words in the song? Dylan, Positively 4th Street. Positively 4th Street, we don't even know where it takes place. Or She Belongs to Me. And so on. So Dylan, in just small ways, if we were listening to him, we would realize, well, the song title is this and the song is that. And it causes your mind to try to have to connect it. What does he mean by calling this song She Belongs to Me? Or Love minus zero over no limit, and it's a mathematical formula.
But I'm sure some people would like to get some questions in, so I believe Peter has the mic. Raise your hand if you have a question.
Raise your hand.
Let him bring the mic to you, because otherwise you will not be heard on, well, you won't be heard by any of us.
My question is about Dylan and Homer. So a criticism of Bob Dylan is that his reluctance to reproduce songs as they might exactly sound on an album live, so that you can hear, for example, The Man in Me, you play it on your album and you go and hear it live and it sounds nothing like it. That he's almost defiling his own greatness, like something he got so right. But how would you compare that to, the unwritten nature of Greek oral poetry, and that Bob Dylan is so reluctant to give the same performance more than once?
Yeah, well, Bob Dylan has talked about the studio. The purpose of the studio album is to get the song down, to get copyright, and he said, I'd never go back and listen to it again. If, however, you heard Don't Think Twice, It's All Right when you were 16, and it reminded you of a relationship, and Bob Dylan does a completely different arrangement of it, he's doing something to you by doing something to that song, because that song, in its arrangement, precise arrangement, was what triggers off your memory of joy, grief, whatever. And so I went to a show in Florida and came out and was listening to, right after the Nobel, and this guy was saying, I slept in my car to do this. No fucking country rock. What a prick. And he was angry. I mean, he was angry. Something had been damaged in him. But Dylan, that's Dylan. Dylan doesn't care. Dylan cares, but he cares about his art, and mostly his art in performance. The recent, in Akron, the Tangled Up and Blue is unrecognizable, the rearrangement of it. It's and so he's doing that to me, because I was 23 when that came out. But you have to learn to go along with it and see what his art is, I think.
The other thing about oral poetic tradition is that oral poetic tradition is not based on pure memorization. You know, it's based on having structures and phrases that one can put into particular spots, so that Homer, again, we have a written down version, but the performed versions would have been different and changed at all moments. So that Dylan is really operating as the ancient oral poets would be, or as the Scottish and Irish and other balladeers would be, changing, leaving and creating new verses because of the nature of the particular audience, or because their own mentalities had changed about that particular love that they wanted to sing about. And the repertory is out there, and you grab bits and pieces. So the oral poets were doing a kind of intertextuality that we can see in literature because we have fixed texts.
Just want to get your opinion. I'm sort of still discovering Bob Dylan. I absolutely love his music. My husband loves his music. Lately, about 3-4 years ago, I discovered this. Well, I saw it on television, of all things. Rhiannon Giddens, Elvis Costello. I thought it was phenomenal when the poetry from, I guess, the Big Pink period came to being, discovered and re-recorded with younger artists. I just want to know what you think of that album, and I have to admit, I do like the song Married to My Hack. I think that's fun.
So which album? Music from Big Pink?
No, the new Basement tapes. Did you hear?
Oh, the new Basement tapes, yeah.
The record, yes.
Yeah,
of
those have been around for Tree with Roots and so on. Those have been around as sort of non-legal boots for some time. I think that's a great question. It's a fantastic period where particularly the Americana of those songs that Dylan is exploring, getting really deep into the 19th century, into the 18th century, which he does a bit on self-portrait and another self-portrait, same sort of period. So Copper Kettle about avoiding whiskey taxes in 1785. So, you know, Dylan is the Civil War, all of that. But those are fantastic tapes, and that they were never, you know, of course in 75, the single album of the Basement tapes came out, but
she's talking about lost songs, the basement it's the Basement tapes continued.
oh, right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I could just say one thing about that, because I mean, I think what's interesting about the Basement tapes is that they've been such a focus for musicians for so long. So the first time around, you have so many artists who take these songs and bring them to a wide population, not, probably maybe not knowing that they were Dylan songs. I mean, Fairport Convention and, oh God, who did Quinn the Eskimo the first time? Who had the big hit with it? Manfred Mann, that's right, Manfred Mann. I mean, so there's all of these artists, but then, 20 odd years later, you have, like you say, Rhiannon Giddens, who just won a MacArthur, I think, and Elvis Costello and others who are rediscovering the songs. And if anything, to me, it just shows, sort of the permanence of Dylan as poet, that those songs can be brought back so far. It's not that long, but really can be given a new life with new artists.
Yeah, and Homer had his Homeridae, that followed him and told stories that he didn't cover, or tried to cover his stories in different ways. And Dylan himself, as you know, I was just listening this afternoon. I have 3, boots from 1988 acoustic. Out of 45 songs, 5 were written by Bob. And these were all things he performed in concert. He was performing 40 traditional folk songs: Venerio, Trail of the Buffalo, Blackjack Davy, just on, The Rose and the Briar, on and on and on and on. And when he needs to regenerate, he goes back to that music. And nothing is clearer to me than what had to precede 97's Time Out of Mind was Dylan in 92 and 93 releasing 2 albums that were entirely traditional Irish, Scottish folk music and blues music, but even blues music by the Black Fiddle Band, the Mississippi Sheiks, Who the heck had ever heard of the Mississippi Sheiks before then? Maybe somebody who was a confirmed ethnomusicologist or somebody, but even Dylan, Dylanophiles had no idea that this music was out there. And when you listen to what Bob does with Stephen Foster's Hard Times, if you listen to Stephen Foster's Hard Times, it's like Camptown Racers. But when Dylan sings it, it is so embedded with pathos for the poor, the poor wandering figures who are not part of the wealth of society, that it just breaks your heart. But Dylan goes into it in order to see what's inside himself and to pour himself into it. So yeah, what these artists are doing is using the example of Bob. They're doing to Bob what Bob does to others, and this is almost like Jesus Christ. Do unto others what they would do unto you, and he had his gospel phase. So
if I could just add another puff for Tempest. So the song "Tin Angel," Joni Mitchell. Where's that coming from? "Tin Angel" starts out. It was late last night when the boss came home, inquiring about his lady. That's the first line of Woody Guthrie's Blackjack Davy, which Dylan covers himself, but that song, "It's late last night when the boss came home inquiring about his lady," the only answer he got, "She's gone with the Blackjack Davy." So the boss rides after them, finds in the Guthrie song, finds the gypsy strumming his big guitar, and the lady has left and is going to go off with the gypsy, even abandoning her baby, so that's the end of song. So Dylan starts "Tin Angel," which is this 9-minute ballad, with that situation, then has the boss riding out, hiring men, the cheapest labor that money could buy, where's that I mean, he's sort of contemporary capitalist is there, comes upon Henry Lee, the leader of the clan, has sort of taken the lady, and the end of it is a sort of combination of the death scenes of Othello and Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, with all three sort of dead in this Shakespearean scene, with dialogue that goes back and forth. I'd have given you the planets and the stars and the planets too, but what good would these gifts do you? With these fantastic lyric, and again starts with a Woody Guthrie line, but has become something that only Bob Dylan could do, because it's the traces of other literatures, Shakespeare and so on, and other folk songs are all there. And so I think I don't know the album you started out with. I mean, yeah, okay. Well, I'll put it on my list.
Back in the back.
I had a question. Does the Bob Dylan Christmas album matter?
Yeah, it does. Here Comes Santa. I have a theory about Here Comes Santa. And you have to see the video of Here Comes Santa. And it's basically, you'll see in the video that a young woman comes running down the stairs, and then a young man who looks like Bob comes running down the stairs. Then an older man comes down, and he's clearly the father, throwing things at him, maybe throwing a Reader's Digest at him, taking you back to Motorcycle in the 60s. And so I think that particular song, I think that, yeah, I mean, I love that song. I make my children listen to it every Christmas, and my wife, so she'll tell you about it. But he did that. He gave all of the proceeds of that to charity, right? So, but I think there are the polkas, the Christmas polkas that he's hearing up in northern Minnesota with all of these Polish miners and stuff. So we haven't gotten onto his religion. We were partly expecting that, but I think I think it all matters, and I think Christmas matters to him. I think he was born again for about a 10-month period, and he came out of that. But I think Jesus has always been there with the Hebrew Bible.
Well, I know it matters because in my autograph collection from various singers and blues singers and folk guys, but the one thing I have that's not from a established artist is Bob Dylan's Christmas album signed to his dear father by my son. So it matters a lot to me.
Have any of you gentlemen met Bob Dylan and had a conversation with him? And if so, what did he have to say to you?
Neither Tom nor I have. Bob doesn't meet. The only Dylanologist I know who has was Christopher Ricks, who author of Bob Dylan's Visions of Sin. So Ricks, who's a great English literary critic and editor, works on Tennyson, T.S. Eliot, and so on. And this was some years ago when Ricks is a professor at Boston University, and Bob was playing in 2004 the college tour, and I think that's the context in which Ricks met him backhand. Ricks tells of sort of having this conversation, and Ricks, who's a very cultured Englishman, said, you know, my mother always taught me to talk about books with people, so they talked about Shakespeare, and then it was time to go, and they taught, of course, Richard III with Laurence Olivier, the evil hunchback of in that movie at the end, has this gesture like this, and Ricks tells of sort of, it was clearly time to go, but do you shake the guitar hand of Bob Dylan? And so he sort of put out his hand, and Dylan went like this. So Dylan, even then, alluding to literature, even as he's doing that. But I don't think, do you know people who've taught?
I know one person in Austin, a rather wealthy couple, who plan their European vacations every year by going to Europe and figuring 3 tour dates when Bob's touring Europe. And about 5 years ago, she went to Cardiff, Wales, a smaller sized town, and was walking around, got there ahead of the concert, obviously, and was walking, and she saw somebody up ahead with socks and sweatpants and a hood up, and about halfway down the block, and she just instantaneously said, Bob, because that's what he does. He goes out in disguise and walks around towns. And he turned around, and it was him. And she went forward, and he said, do I know you? And he said, no, but I'm a great fan of yours. Oh, where are you from? She said, I'm from Austin. Oh, that's where Charlie Sexton's from. Does Charlie know you? I'll let Charlie, but he was really engaging. And then she said, I'm going to the concert tonight. And it's my son's birthday, so could you perhaps, did you write Forever Young? You wrote Forever Young for his children. He said, yes, but that was a long time ago. And he said, could you play that for my son because it's her birthday? And he kind of did this. And then she said, can I take your picture? And he really nodded at that. And so she to try to save the situation, she said, oh, you believe like the Native Americans that if I take a picture of you, I'll steal your soul. And he looked and he said, like this, and then he just turned and walked away. But she immediately ran back to her hotel room and got on the internet and emailed me and Gavin Garcia, whom you know, because she said she wanted to get it all down just exactly. But that's it. That's my vicarious link to Bob Dylan. But again, it was purely human. He didn't have to stop and talk. He didn't have to engage in the questions, and he wasn't dismissive. But he just gave these little nods when no, that's not. But this was last. There's another guy in town who there was a pool among Dylan fans to guess the set lists at the time, what would be on the next set list at a time when Dylan played a radically different set list every night. And so when she wrote back, he put immediately on for the next night, Forever Young, which Dylan hadn't played in months, and he played it the next night at the next stop. So.
I have nothing. I think we have one in the back.
This is a related question. When he's touring, like when he was in Akron the other day, does he talk to the audience? Does he converse with the audience?
No. He's and I have a bit in the book about this. He he used to do vaudeville jokes. Larry Campbell likes to wear. Likes golfing, and so when he goes on tour, he wears 2 pairs of pants in case he gets a hole in one. So he went through a period of that, but now, and I have a view of, as I've already alluded to, about the concerts. I think they have a triadic structure. he says in a couple of interviews, I've been thinking in triads, and the interviewer says, oh, you mean like Sinatra's yesterday, today, and tomorrow? And Bob says, no, I mean more like Aeschylus's Oresteia, the three Greek tragedies. And so, yeah, 60s to begin with, one song from the 70s, and the later stuff. And so, and I think that it's a concert. It's like opera. So he doesn't talk. He's a singer. He's not. Why would the singer talk? It's a performance. It's a play. And I think it goes with the fact that if you go out, you're not allowed to come back until there's a break between songs. No cell phones, not even for calling, so that I've seen people get thrown out for just looking at their cell phone. And it makes it a much more serious concert-going experience. You don't have people who are there so they can say to their friends, oh, I went to a Bob Dylan concert, but they're sort of talking through this fantastic music. So I think for all of those reasons, I think we're not gonna hear him talking again.
And he also has gestures on stage that are very much like watching a silent film or something. In other words, he'll gesture at a key moment, and these are meaningful. They attach themselves to the songs he's singing. So yeah, there's nothing. Remember, in the Christian phase, he would preach from the in between songs.
So we could clearly go on for quite a while here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to invite one last question here, and then I'm going to invite you all to take your questions to our panelists after the talk or out in the hall where Richard will be signing copies of his book. So one more question here.
I'd like to thank all of you, you gentlemen, for speaking with us tonight. So you wondered if you get a question about Dylan's faith or his religion. This isn't so much about what you think about what his faith is, but thinking about him and using the language of religion. And you talked about how early in his career, perhaps he wasn't aware that he was doing something like Homer or like Virgil, but now he's more conscious of it. So I think about lines like, the first one now will later be last, a gospel line. And was that sort of, he was inspired by that? Or now you think of something like Spirit on the water, darkness on the face of the deep. Or one sweet day I'll stand beside my king. Is that similar to you? And what's your comment on that in terms of, is he trying to in some way create scripture or sacred text? Or is he still being influenced by that? And where does that play out, I guess?
Yeah, I think the songwriter is using those texts to create songs whose singer has connections to Hebrew and Christian Bible, and that singer. So we have it's not dark yet, right? So I was born here and I'll die here against my choice. So it's in the book of Daniel and in the Kabbalah, that birth is unfair because in being born we're destined to die. So quite a Jewish thought. The next song, Cold Irons Bound, I went to church on Sunday as she walked by. So here's a church-going Christian. Next song. So I think what I encourage with my students is to think in terms of the songs as songs, as you would read a novel, and not necessarily identify a character in a novel with the novelist. So I think we really need to, with Dylan, to realize that he's doing that. I believe he has very deep faith. I happen to know a rabbi who occasionally Dylan visits. So I think it's almost, his practice is almost irrelevant to that. I mean, that sounds sacrilegious, but I think he's a songwriter, and he insists on its being the song. And we want to know what Bob Dylan is because he's such a effing attractive person, even at 76, that we want to know what Bob's thinking through these powerful songs. But that's my...
I would say, just to reemphasize what Richard says, I think Dylan has a deep, almost unfathomably deep reverence for the human experience. And he's been exploring it in every way, shape, or form. When you think of something like mid-career, before not in though the so-called gospel phase, like "Shelter from the Storm," right? And it was used as a theme song in what was it, Maguire? What was the name of the movie with Tom Hanks? What was it called? Yeah, Barry Maguire. So Jerry Maguire. Barry Maguire is what, Eva Destruction or something like that, right? And Dylan believes that too. One of the quotes I was reading says he thinks that we've been just constantly moving towards the apocalypse as human beings. But if you think of Shelter from the Storm, you know, she took down my crown of thorns. Come in, she said, I'll give you shelter from the storm. In a little Hilltop village, they gambled for my clothes. You know, I offered up to salvation. They offered us, and they gave me a lethal dose. I mean, just a really an amazing song. So that, and he's able to even. I consider, you know, when we talk about him being Homeric, the Greeks had this term, we're professors. And he says, you know, you've been with their professors and they all like your looks, right? With great lawyers, you discuss leopards and crooks. But professors have passion because, you know, we live with the knowledge that we are constantly investigating. And when we get in front of a group like you, we're just having questions like this, having people be attentive to something we think about. Of course, we want to speak forward. But Dylan is not a professor, he's a prophetes. He's a prophetes, like an Old Testament prophet. He's a speaker forth of truths, and you get on the truth in your book, and that's the one thing we haven't covered yet. Truth to Dylan, to Tim O'Brien, to people who really understand, is not factual information, which quickly evaporates. Truth is something that's essential to the human experience. And that's why most of you have read Tim O'Brien, where he says fiction is the only truth. Because if you're going to try to explain to somebody what it was like to be in a firefight in Vietnam, or to walk out through a minefield every day, wondering whether you were going to get blown up, there's no way of communicating that except by going off into the realm of what we call untruth. And Dylan feels the same way. You know, people excoriated him because of Reuben Hurricane Carter. Oh, you can disprove all the facts in the Reuben Hurricane Carter. He just not, at one point when he was asked that, he just shrugged and said, well, so give him another name. Now, make it not be about Reuben Hurricane Carter. Because essentially I'm talking about what it's like to be a black man in the United States. And so Reuben Hurricane Carter may have been guilty of sin, but it doesn't mean that blacks are not, you know, as we all know. So
I think we should, at this point, because we could go on for quite a long time, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming, and I hope to see you again at future events at the Baker Nord Center. And please join me in thanking our panel.